instructions and do this.
Okay.
Not spiritually supposed to take out of this.
Out of Numbers or Leviticus? Out of Numbers. We'll cover that today. So, yeah, we'll get there in just a second. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
My God, we thank you for working cameras and working TVs. And we thank you for everyone's patience. I pray as we walk through the book of Numbers, we may learn to walk closer with you. Amen. Okay, so today we are going to look at the book of Numbers. I have two handouts, but before I hand them out, we're going to look at our PowerPoint. And we have 3 videos that we're going to watch as well. And so that's going to be really exciting. Oh, and you're going to really love the first video. It's 1 minute and 11 seconds, and it will be great. I also have a few leftover handouts. So here's the 10 plagues one, if someone might want that. I've been trying to give that away for a while. This is our, not last week because of the funeral, but the week before when we did our overview of Leviticus. If anyone really, do you want that? So we'll pass that down to Connie, and then I'll make another one. I think make 2. Okay, I'll add it in the email. I have one more. This, which I'll pass to you. This is a animated like little. It's a chart. There's an animated video that goes along with it. So there's one more of Leviticus. I think that is all the Leviticus. Yes. And when I send out the summary email, I'll send a link to it. I also have these charts of who wrote the Bible and when it was written. And I will just leave those up here just in case someone might want them. So Numbers, that's a great question. What is the point of reading Numbers? And I really want to hear from people's experience of what you've read from Numbers in the past. When you think of like, what's the point of Numbers? What do you think of? And why does it have that name?
Because they took the census.
So they took the census. We get our name Numbers because the first chapter, there's a census and they count everyone. Does anyone know the other name for Numbers?
The murmuring.
I mean, it's in the wilderness is the Hebrew. It's the first word in Hebrew, which I don't know how to say it in Hebrew, but it's going to be up here, and then we can look at it. Any other thoughts on Numbers, kind of before we start to work our way through?
I kind of liked it, and I didn't think I would, and I thought it would be boring, but it had some good things in it. And I liked the part about the snakes. The poisonous snakes.
They are, yeah, that pops up soon.
And actually, that is in our lectionary, our readings for Sunday.
Yeah.
About the snake.
So there's this really big scene, and if on an ambulance there's a bronze serpent, it comes back from this story in Numbers. And so essentially Israel's being bad, and so God sends a bunch of vipers, and they start to kill the people. And the way that they're rescued from it is they make a bronze snake and they hold it up. And whoever looks to it is saved from the snakes. And so that's in our readings this Sunday. It's a connection to the cross, whoever looks to the cross. Yeah, but that's why ambulances have a bronze snake on it. Did y'all know that? Oh, okay. I just learned that a few years ago. I thought it was super cool. So here's what we're going to look at coming up. Today we are doing our Numbers overview. Next week, we're going to do the tribes of Israel. It's spring break. Numbers starts off by naming the different tribes. Is this flashing behind me? Okay. And so we're, instead of like not meeting over spring break, we're just going to do a special topic. And we're going to look at the tribes of Israel. And it'll be a shorter meet. March 21st, we'll do Numbers 1 through 4. But then y'all said let's not meet Holy Week. So we will be off on the 28th and on April 4th. Because the church will be closed the week after Easter. So I will send this back out and put no meeting for Holy Week. But there is a Maundy Thursday service that night, so you should come to that if you're into that sort of thing. So when we look at our kind of overview of our couple of books, this is the same. I feel like I'm in the way. Can you all see the TV?
Push the TV over about 2 feet.
Is that better, like there?
Yes, thank you.
So this is kind of our overview of our different books. I'm just leaving it in the PowerPoint for those that want to go back and look at it. But when we come to Numbers, you're going to see that it's mainly red, and that means it was mainly written by the priestly source. And I'm going to comment on that in a moment, but here's our look at all the different books that we've looked at so far. Yeah.
Can you back up 1 second?
Yeah.
Why does the priestly source end in Numbers? Do they all die out?
So the Pentateuch, or those first 5 books, are the last books that are written. And so when that was being compiled together, it was after the exile, and they were rebuilding the temple. So some of the strongest factions for Jews in that day was the priestly group, because they were rebuilding the temple. And so they influenced most of the writing of those 5 books.
Okay.
But the other ones were already written.
Okay.
And so, because they are the later books are actually the older books, and then this is the last books that are compiled. Does that make sense? Okay.
Thank you.
And Deuteronomy is like a retelling, essentially, of these other ones. I feel like this keeps flashing at me, but I can't tell if that's just me. This is this chart that's a handout if you want it, that just has all the different books. This is just there in case people want to look at it. I've left it in. But we're going to play this little puppet show. And this is about the book of Numbers. So I hope you enjoy it. It's only 1 minute.
Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. Numbers? Why would they name a book Numbers? Well, because it starts out with a big list of numbers. If you remember, Leviticus is a big book of laws and regulations given to Moses at Mount Sinai. Well, as Numbers starts, it's time to head for the Promised Land. So what do first? They count everybody and write it all down. Hence the name Numbers. Most of the book actually involves the Israelites wandering around in the desert, which is why the Hebrew name for the book is Bamidbar, meaning in the desert. That makes a lot more sense, but Bamidbar isn't very catchy. Neither is Haggai, but that's beside the point. So Numbers is a book about a big number of Israelites who wander around in the desert for 40 years instead of going to the Promised Land. Why were they stuck in the desert? Pastor Paul?
They were on time out. God saved them from Pharaoh's army and brought them across the Red Sea. And what did they do? Started complaining.
Yep. That is a defunct YouTube channel. I have no idea why. But it was a very short 1 minute, and I like how it said the names of the book of Numbers. So kind of the Greek influence name is based on having a census, and that's where we get that word numbers, because they count everyone. But the Hebrew word is in the wilderness. And I kind of like that name a lot more, in the wilderness, because that's all that the book of Numbers is about. It's about them being in the wilderness. This is our kind of summary of each of the books that we've looked at. So Exodus, our kind of main point was, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. That was what we tried to remember throughout all of it. In Leviticus, sorry, I don't know why these are all blurry. Oh, there it goes. In Leviticus, we tried to remember this phrase, be holy for I, the Lord your God, am holy. And that was kind of the point, if you will, of the book of Leviticus. It's about being holy and the different ways that you be holy. In Numbers, though, we get a different idea. Let's wait for that to clear. I don't know why is this? So there's a picture in the background of this, and if it clears up, it is all of the tribes of Israel encamped around the tabernacle. So that's kind of the setup that they have in the book of Numbers. The tabernacle is in the middle of the camp, and they divide the 12 tribes into different sections that they encamp around the tabernacle, which I think is kind of cool, how they do that. But the phrase that we want to remember throughout the book of Numbers is rebellion in the wilderness. I had a lot of trouble trying to find like a summary verse. And so when I look at the book of Numbers as a whole, though, it's about rebellion in the wilderness. And it kind of oscillates between rebellion and return, rebellion and return, rebellion and return. The book starts off with this word in the desert or in the wilderness, which is that Bamidbar word. It is a mainly kind of priestly written source, so it's very concerned about the tabernacle and how you worship. And one of the things that we always just has as a reminder, so these first 5 books, they're written after the exile, And so Babylon came and carried off all of Israel and Judah. And so they're in exile. And now they're returning to the land. And that's when the first 5 books of the Bible kind of get finalized. And so you can kind of see the resemblance of Numbers. The book of Numbers is all about being in the wilderness, trying to get to the promised land, trying to get to that land that God had promised you. And this would be a very meaningful book for you if you're stuck in another country and you're trying to get back to your land. And so that's kind of one of the points of the book of Numbers. Interesting fact, there's different versions of Numbers that kind of are floating around. So there's the Septuagint or the Greek version, and there's the Hebrew version. But there's also older ones that we have, so in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in the Samaritan Pentateuch. And they're almost exactly the same. There's a few slight variations. Some of those differences are the numbers of like the people of Israel. There's a few other small things, but they all have primarily the same point. Any questions on that? Okay. I wanted to remember this. So if we remember in Exodus was all about building the tabernacle. And we spent most of the book on top of Mount Sinai. And there was like 3 series where God is instructing them how to build the tabernacle and celebrate different festivals. And then they actually build it and celebrate it. And then there's a summary of once they've already built it. And it just keeps throwing it in your mind. And Exodus was all about building the tabernacle and how you worship. Leviticus begins in a different spot. So the book of Exodus ends when Moses can't go in the tabernacle. And it's kind of a strange end to the book. Like, we spent a whole book building this place for us to worship God, and God's dwelling in it, but the people can't go in it. And Leviticus kind of answers that question. Well, how do we get in the tabernacle? How do we actually worship God? And so Leviticus starts, and this is what we looked at 2 weeks ago. God is calling out to Moses from within the tabernacle. Numbers begins, God is talking to Moses inside the tabernacle, which is really cool. And so the book of Leviticus was all about like how to be holy and how to enter the tabernacle. Now they're in the tabernacle so they can worship God. And so it's all about moving that worship of God to a permanent place, which is about getting to the promised land. What happens in the book of Numbers is that the people keep messing that up and they keep rebelling. And does anyone know what happens to all of the adults that rebel and don't enter the promised land? They all die. So a whole generation dies off, which to us sounds like a very harsh kind of setup for a book. But for the time when this is written, this is actually a very merciful act. Part of the covenant was if these people break the covenant, God would wipe them out and they wouldn't exist anymore. Instead, God makes a way for their offspring to still go into the promised land. And so it's supposed to be an act of mercy with there still being consequences to sin. Some of the other verses that I thought we might name this when I was trying to make our graphic for it. So this is from Numbers 14. This is one of the core kind of sections of the book. Not one of the men who saw my glory and the miraculous signs I performed in Egypt and in the desert, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times. Not one of them will see the land I promised and on oath to their forefathers. No one who has treated me with contempt will see it. That is a verse that is not a very hopeful verse, but it is a good summary of this book, that the people don't get to go on to the promised land, which is why they wander for so long. Some of the other ones, it's Numbers 9:18. At the Lord's command, the Israelites set out, and at his command they encamped. And as long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle, they remained in the camp. Numbers 32:23. Be sure your sins will find you out. And Numbers 14:27. I have heard the complaints of the Levites. These are all, when I looked up summary verses, these are the examples that they gave. So I stuck with rebellion in the wilderness. I thought that was a little bit better. So, okay. We already did our overview of these, and I'm going to talk now about who wrote the book of Numbers. Oh, I don't know why this is so fuzzy today. So my favorite Bible is this Oxford Annotated Bible, And this is just straight out from the commentary on Numbers that was here. But if you're kind of nerdy and you want to look at the different sources or the authors that wrote the book of Numbers, there's 3 main kind of groupings. So there's a bunch of independent sources. One example of that is Numbers 21. It has a quote from another work that we don't have this other work anymore. But it says, from there they set out and they camped on the other side of Arnon, which is in the desert and boundaries between the Amorite territory. For Arnon is the border of Moab between Moab and the Amorites. And that's why the book of wars of the Lord, or the book of wars of Yahweh, says, and then it quotes something from that book. It's really cool because there's a lot of places in Numbers where it quotes these other sources or these other texts. That's just one example. There's also a bunch of non-priestly literature as well as priestly literature. So you can kind of just think of any of the action scenes that take place. Those are probably the non-priestly ones that take place in the middle of the book, like when they go to fight another people group or something like that. The moments when it's laying out other parts, so most of the rest of the book, it's from the priestly source. And so that's chapters kind of 1 through 10. There's a small section at the end of chapter 10 that's non-priestly. 11 through 21, then there's a bunch of action scenes, and then the rest of the book is priestly. So nobody cares about that sort of thing. But if you do, I left in the PowerPoint a more detailed explanation. And this gives, so this is from this commentary. It gives examples of those other sources if you just wanted to read that because you're weird like I am. So, but no one else cares, so we're not going to do that. Man, I don't know why this is so blurry. I'm going to make sure my computer is connected to the internet. It is. Okay. Well, this is our chart of Genesis that we looked at. Here's the chart of Exodus.
Are you an optometrist trying to get us to buy glasses?
I buy mine on Zenni online. They're $40. I don't know why it's not loading, but that's okay because we're going to pass around our chart of numbers here. I do have Wi-Fi down here. I'm assuming it's just not as strong.
There it is.
Oh, here we go. So this is our chart of numbers. I think I made 15 of these. Is that enough? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
I think there's about 30.
Okay. This is the chart of numbers. We're going to watch the corresponding video that goes with it. I just want to point out one part. When you break up the book, you'll see like 3 kind of columns. So there's chapters 1 through 10, 13 through 19, and then there's chapters 22 through 36. That is how the Bible Project, who makes this, makes up the book. I have a handout, and we're going to look at some other ways you could outline this as well. We got an extra one? Oh, cool. All right, are you guys ready for the video?
The Book of Numbers. This 4th book of the Bible carries forward the story of Israel after their exodus from slavery in Egypt. God had brought them to Mount Sinai, and He entered into a covenant with them there. And despite Israel's rebellion, God had graciously provided a way for Israel to live near His holy presence in the tabernacle. So the Book of Numbers begins as Israel wraps up their 1-year stay at Mount Sinai, and they head out into the wilderness on their way to the land that God promised to Abraham. Now the book's storyline is designed according to the stages of their journey. So the first section begins at Mount Sinai, but then they set out and travel to the wilderness of Paran. And then from there, they travel to the plains of Moab, which is right across from the Promised Land. Now the first part opens with a census where the people are numbered. That's where the book gets its name. And then there are laws about how the tribes of Israel were to be arranged in their camp. So the tabernacle was to be at the center, and then around that, the priests and the Levites, and then around them, the 12 tribes neatly arranged with Judah at their head. Now, this was all an elaborate symbol about how God's holy presence was at the center of their existence as a people. This is all followed by a whole series of laws that develop the purity laws from the book of Leviticus. If God's presence was going to be in their midst, every effort should be made to make the camp pure, a place that welcomes God's holiness. In chapter 10, the cloud of God's presence lifts from the tabernacle and guides Israel away from Sinai out into the wilderness. And immediately things go terribly wrong. So in chapter 11, the people start complaining about their hunger and thirst and how they want to go back to Egypt. And then in chapter 12, Moses' own brother and sister begin opposing and bad-mouthing him in front of all of the people. This trip is not off to a good start. The next section begins as the Israelites arrive in the desert of Paran, about halfway to the Promised Land. And God tells Moses to send out the 12 spies, one for each tribe, so they can scout out the Promised Land. So when the spies all return, 10 of them say that there is no chance Israel can survive there because the Canaanites will destroy them. But there are 2 spies, Caleb and Joshua, who say that God can save them. But the 10 whip up the people into a fearful rage, and they start planning a mutiny. They're going to appoint a new leader and head back to Egypt. So God is understandably angry, and Moses intercedes on the people's behalf. He calls God to be faithful to his promises to Abraham. And so God does, but not at the expense of his justice. He gives these Israelites what they want, to not enter the land. And God sentences this generation to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until they die. Only their children will get to enter the Promised Land. Now you'd think this severe consequence would wake them up, but it gets even worse. So in the next story, there's a whole group of Levites that begin a rebellion. And they challenge Moses and Aaron's leadership, saying that they have gone way too far. So God deals severely with these Levites, and he renews his commitment to Moses and Aaron as Israel's leaders. Now as they leave the region of Paran and hit the road, it goes downhill yet again. The Israelites start complaining again about their thirst, and they ask why Moses even brought them out of Egypt in the first place. So God tells Moses to speak to a rock to bring out water for all of the people. But Moses doesn't really do this. He oversteps his bounds. He hits the rock twice and then says, "You rebels, do we have to bring water out of this rock?" So Moses dishonors God by putting himself in God's place as the one who brings out the water. And so Moses brings down on himself the same fate as the wilderness generation. He too will die in the desert and never get to enter the Promised Land. After this, the Israelites rebel yet again, and God brings a very strange judgment on them, venomous snakes to come and bite the people. And so Moses again intercedes on behalf of the people. And God tells Moses to do this, to make a bronze snake and to lift it up on a pole, so that whoever looks at this snake would be healed of the poisonous snake bite. It's a very strange symbol. But it speaks to the challenge that God has by being faithful to his covenant. He's right to bring justice on the Israelites' evil and sin. But even God's justice gets transformed into a source of life for those who will look to God for healing. From here, the people head into the plains of Moab. And the first main part of this section focuses on the strange figure of Balaam. So the king of Moab is freaked out at this huge group of people traveling through his territory. So he hires a pagan sorcerer, Balaam, to pronounce curses on Israel. And 3 different times, Balaam finds that he cannot curse them. He can utter only blessing upon Israel. Remember God's promise to Abraham from Genesis 12. So not only can Balaam not curse Israel, but God actually gives him a vision about a future Israelite king who will one day bring God's justice to all of the nations. This vision recalls Jacob's promise to Judah in Genesis chapter 49. Now it's worth stopping to reflect on the flow of the book so far. The rebellion stories in the wilderness, they just heap up on one another, getting worse and worse. And while God does bring partial acts of judgment on Israel, he's also kept showing mercy, providing food and water along the way. And so the Balaam story, it shows God's grace in bright colors. Because here's Israel. They're down in the camp, grumbling and rebelling. But up in the hills, unbeknownst to them, God is protecting and even blessing them. And it's this contrast between Israel's rebellion and God's faithfulness in the wilderness, that's what made these stories so important for later generations of Israel. So the wilderness stories are retold time and again by later biblical prophets and poets, and even by the apostles in the New Testament. And these stories always serve as a warning that while God will remain faithful to his covenant promises, he will also allow his people to walk away in rebellion and face the consequences. After this, the rest of the book focuses on the children of the wilderness generation, and they begin preparing to inherit the promised land. They take another census of the new generation, then they go on and win a number of battles with the people groups around them, and then a few tribes even begin to settle in the promised land. So the book ends with the new generation poised to enter into the land, and Moses is about to deliver his final words of wisdom and warning. But for now, that's what the book of Numbers is all about.
So the book of Numbers is exciting because there's actually stuff that happens in it. I feel like when we read Exodus, my memory of Exodus included a lot of the events that happened in Numbers. And when we never got there in Exodus, like I felt very confused because my brain has kind of mixed Exodus and Numbers together. And so when you hear Numbers, the name sounds boring, so we think of it kind of like Leviticus, but Numbers is a book that's filled with a lot of action, and it really is kind of oscillating between that rebellion and that returning to God. Before we move on, any questions or like highlights from watching this?
That symbol, is that Balaam or whatever?
This guy?
Your number, yeah, who is he?
I think that's the witchcraft guy. You don't want to dress up like him? I will say just like one thing to kind of be hopeful with. Try not to think of the word numbers. Try to use that Hebrew phrase of in the wilderness or the Hebrew name in the wilderness. It really, to me, that helps kind of give a fresh look when I look at it. I wanted to show you another outline way. So the Bible Project kind of breaks it into those 3 sections of where they are. But another way of breaking out the book, so this is from the New Oxford Annotated, this is their outline, is that you can break up the book with the first generation and what happens in the second generation. And this is an interesting way of looking at it because the first generation, so these are those who started off and they go to the promised land. They send all these spies to look in the land and everyone's like, oh my gosh, we can't do this. Let's go back to Egypt. And meanwhile, this is only 1 month after the Exodus, like with all the plagues and everything happens. And so they just defeated like the most powerful nation in the ancient world is kind of what's happening in the story. And then they look in the promised land and they say, God's not powerful enough to kind of help us live here. And so that's the first mistake of the first generation, but they keep rebelling. They keep rebelling. They time and time again, they keep rebelling. One of the most monumental ways of remembering that is the story of Korah. He is one of the other priests. And the ground, like Moses, draws a line in the sand and says, if you're with me and with Yahweh, stand on this side. If you're with Korah and you want to go back to Egypt, go on that side. And then the ground opens up and eats them all and swallows them up. And they're like, okay, that settles it. Let's move on. Yeah. That's one way to win an argument. And so what we see with the first generation, though, is they keep rebelling. The second generation, though, these are the ones that they've kind of learned their lesson and they follow God. And that's going to come with a lot of successes for them. And so that's displayed in the text with a lot of military battles and with some other things that are going to happen. And so it's really painting a picture for us. When I follow God, God goes with me. When I turn away from God, God kind of lets me face my own consequences of turning away. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's one way of dividing up the book, the first and the second generation. But I really like this way that it's broken up with the Bible Project. So I am passing around a handout. This is my outline of the book. I'm actually going to keep just one of these. And this is going to follow all of our different readings in here. And I've broken them up into these different sections as what's going around. Oh, don't look at that yet. Wait, where'd it go? I must have rearranged this PowerPoint from what I thought. Okay. So in the back, this is our picture summary of the book. And so there's all the tribes all centered around the tabernacle and our phrase, rebellion in the wilderness. On the front, you'll see this picture of the bottom. It's the 3 different locations that kind of the stories take place in. And then this is our outline of the book. And then I put the three different kind of names of the book is this first line under where it says Book of Numbers. So in the desert or in the wilderness, that's the Hebrew name, or census, that's the Greek name where we get numbers from. And then in the middle, it starts off with God calls to Moses in the tent. But these readings are how we are going to read through the book of Numbers together. So our first week, we're going to read verses 1, or chapters 1, verse 1. It might have hit 30 minutes on it. Okay. So here's our book of Numbers on this chart. Here is our outline and our reading guide for when we'll be going through the book of Numbers. But there's another video that the Bible Project has that I wanted to show you because it's just another way of looking at it. So it doesn't go through this chart, but it does kind of recover an overview of the book.
The Book of Numbers gets overlooked, partly because it has a really boring name.
Which is a shame. In the Hebrew tradition, the book's name is Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness. And it's an epic travelogue about Israel's journey through the desert on their way to the land promised to Abraham.
Now, this pilgrimage should only take about 2 weeks on foot.
But instead, it takes them about 40 years.
That's crazy. It's practically half of someone's lifetime.
Yeah, it's a very long camping trip with lots of interesting stories. But let's remember, it's most helpful to back up and start with how this book is designed.
Right.
So the book is broken up into 5 sections. There are 3 wilderness locations, broken up by 2 road trips that link all the pieces together.
The first wilderness section is Mount Sinai, right here on the map.
And then in the second section, they travel to a region called Paran.
A whole bunch of things happen here in the wilderness of Paran.
And then in this 4th section is Israel's road trip to Moab.
The book ends with a large section in the wilderness of Moab, right across the Jordan River from the Promised Land.
Now, through all of these sections, the storyline just flows like a gripping dramatic movie. Everything starts great, but then the trip goes horribly wrong, and it all ends with the final redemptive moment, the surprising act of God's grace.
So let's jump into the story. It all begins at the wilderness at Mount Sinai, and we've become really familiar with this mountain.
Yeah, if you remember, Israel came here after Egypt, and they formed a covenant with God here, got the 10 Commandments here, built the tabernacle here, and they've been at this mountain for 1 full year.
And now they take a census to number the people as they prepare to leave.
Right, and they're given these instructions for how to organize all those people in the camp. God's presence in the tabernacle, and then the tribe of Levi and the priests around it, and then the rest of the tribes.
I don't think I like this room. I think the Wi-Fi is not as...
Issues at Brotherhood all the time with Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
Around them. And this pattern, it's this visual symbol for how God's holiness is at the center of their existence as a people.
And they're told that when the cloud of God...
I'm gonna pause this and let it buffer for a minute. So there's just a couple of questions about numbers that pop up a lot. So a lot of people will ask about the 600,000 number when the census is given. So for the curious, there is not historical evidence of 2 million people wandering through a desert for 40 years. That amount of people would leave a lot of historical artifacts, mainly trash. People leave, cultures leave around a lot of trash where they go. Also, for most of the makeup of Canaan at this time, there was no kingdom with 2 million people anywhere. It's like the whole area of land had 2 million people. And so one group immigrating into the area with that many people would probably be an exaggerated number, but it's matching back to that description. So remember, this is written in exile, thousands of years after the stories are taking place. It's going back to that promise of God expanding a people and growing a people. I thought I had another hot question that I was gonna ask. One other thing I just thought was interesting. So in the Samaritan version of this, they have a different holy mountain, and so it doesn't start at Mount Sinai. So the locations are different. They start on the Samaritan holy mountain, and that's one of the only big major differences. And they have a smaller number of people. Does anyone have any other questions?
So
This is almost.
the big numbers were used just to make the impression that this was a huge group, or?
So one of the things a lot of ancient writers do is they typically inflate their own numbers and deflate their kind of enemies' numbers. And it's a way of talking about who God's favor is with. So it's not trying to like lie or something like that. They just like we're more interested in factual data, and they're more interested in, well, why did you say that? What does it mean? And what it means with these numbers is God's favor is with Israel.
So actually, physically, they were like 2 weeks away from, I mean, I've been there. It's like, oh my gosh, it's just around the corner, you know,
Yeah.
they wandered for 40 years. It wouldn't have held that many people. I mean, the space would not, when you think about it. Just the number of people
Yeah.
that would be there, and tents and, you know, whatever else they had.
And all livestock and everything else that they had too. Well, that's one of the things we talked about too. Like the tabernacle that they're carrying around is like over 20,000 pounds of gold and metal, that's a lot of metal. But it's a way of saying worshiping God is important, and so we give a lot to this. Yeah, that's one of the things we kept joking on our chart is if they're just trying to go here, why do they keep going like this? And you say, well, you got 40 years, you got to go somewhere. All right, I think this is buffered enough for now.
They're to pack up and travel with it.
Yeah, the Ark of the Covenant is carried by the Levites out in front, and then the tribe of Judah, and on and on. And this order is also a symbol for how God's holy presence is their leader and guide through the wilderness.
We begin the second section of the book with enthusiasm as they leave Mount Sinai and travel up to Paran. God's with them, everything's organized. This is going to be great.
But it's not great. After just 3 days on the road, the people are complaining about their hunger and thirst, and then even Moses' brother and sister start bad-mouthing him in front of all the people.
Not a great start. But now we're into the third section, the wilderness of Paran. This is where they send the 12 spies to scout out the promised land. 2 of those spies come back and they're really optimistic.
But the other 10 are freaked out, and they don't trust God, and they go around saying, we're going to get annihilated in there. And so they start a mutiny, and they try to appoint a new leader who's going to take all the people back to Egypt. And so basically, they are refusing to go into the promised land, and God honors their choice. He says that this generation is going to wander for 40 years and die in the wilderness, and only their kids will get to enter the promised land.
You know, this story here gets brought up many times in the Bible by different authors.
Yeah, and it always serves as a reminder that while God remains faithful to his people and his promises, he will honor their choices. He'll let them waste their whole lives if they choose to live in rebellion.
Okay, so the trip's been a disaster so far.
And it gets worse here in this fourth section as they're traveling to Moab. Even Moses has a moment of rebellion and is disqualified from entering the promised land. Then there's another rebellion among the people that results in this snake attack. And what makes all these rebellions even worse is that every step of the way, God has been providing. He's been offering forgiveness. He's been giving them food and water and this crazy stuff called manna.
Yeah, what is that stuff?
Yeah, no idea. But in spite of all this, they keep complaining, and they say that they wish they had died in slavery in Egypt.
If I was God, I would just give up on these guys.
You would think. But that's what makes this story in the final section so surprising. Israel has just arrived in Moab, and the king of Moab is freaked out that this huge group of people is traveling through his land. So he hires this pagan sorcerer named Balaam to pronounce curses on them.
This guy means business.
Yeah, and so Balaam, he says, okay, I'm going to pray to the Hebrew God, and let's see what happens. And 3 different times he attempts to curse them, but each time he finds that he can utter only blessing. Most surprising is the last blessing, where he prophesies that out of Israel will rise a victorious king. And this king is somehow going to be connected to God's promise to Abraham to bless all nations through this family. So here's Israel rebelling down in the camp, totally unaware that up in the hills, God is protecting and even blessing them.
The book ends here in Moab. Israel's getting ready to go into the promised land. They count up everyone again, just like at the beginning. They're leaving the old generation behind, including Moses.
But before they leave Moses, he gives them his last words of warning and wisdom. And that speech is what the next book, Deuteronomy, is all about.
So I really like this one. This is called their Torah series, and it's kind of about convincing people to read the Bible that don't read the Bible. And I really love that one because they just have really cool animation that goes along with it. For our outline, so next time that we meet, when we look at Numbers, we're going to read those first 4 chapters plus a little bit extra. And just an explanation about this, and it's on this handout. This is the Hebrew word. It's the first word in this section. And so that's the name of the section. And then this is an English translation of the Hebrew word. And then I put down here essentially a summary of what content it covers. When we go through and read all of these, I will send an outline of those like 4 chapters along with it, since y'all said that was kind of made it easier to read through. But yeah, that's how that is. It's the Hebrew word, the English translation, and then kind of what content it covers in that little section. And then I broke it up in like where it takes place, kind of location-wise. So next week, we'll do the tribes of Israel. The week after, we'll do Numbers 1 through 4. And then we'll take a break for 2 weeks. And then we'll start to work our way a little bit quicker through Numbers. But yeah, that is the book of Numbers with a brief overview. Any questions on Numbers?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, so they're wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years. And it never made sense to me. But am I to understand one of the reasons they are wandering around for 40 years is so that old generation can die?
Yep, exactly. 40 is also a number in the Bible that represents a set segment of time of like preparation or something like that, like a phase. So like, for instance, like Moses' life, the first 40 years he spends in Egypt, the next 40 years he spends in Midian or wherever it is that he is, and then the next 40 years are with Israel. So he comes back for the Exodus in this next phase. 40 is like the number, like our Lent is 40 days because it's that preparation. Elijah spends 40 days out in the wilderness. It rained for 40 days when the flood happened. Like that is a number that represents a set series. So it's not a literal number, but it's a next phase, if you will. So, but yeah, it's waiting for everyone to die off. But when you think of the alternative, the covenant was that they all would have been wiped out and killed. I'd rather, spend my life walking around in the desert than dead. Maybe, I don't know. Depends on the desert. That was a good question.
Were Caleb and Joseph the 2 spies out of the 12 that were believers were they the only ones that got to go into the Holy Land?
Caleb and Joshua they're the oldest. They're the only ones from that first generation that go in. And so so Joshua is the military leader, and it's funny enough, Caleb and his family, they get prime pick of any land that he wants. And Caleb's like real old. He's like 80 years old or something. He's like, I think we're going to pick this rocky mountain right here. And so they keep running up and down it, which ends up being good for them because later in the story when there's a battle, it's a very easy to defend place. But yeah, they're the only 2. Any other?
That's a real life story. I told you I was in the Peace Corps. The country I was in is surrounded by the Republic of South Africa, but it's not absorbed, and it was because it was on a butte. And when the Boers and the English tried to attack it, the late 1800s, the Basutos just rolled rocks on it.
Oh, God.
And they said, we're tired of it, and it's just mountainous, leave them alone, and it's stayed independent. But it's the exact same story.
Oh, interesting. It's like kind of like the Swiss Family Robinson. They drop the logs down on the pirates that come up. Well, that's true too. So Jerusalem, and whenever you'll read in the Old Testament, it'll say they go up to Jerusalem. It's because Jerusalem's up on a mountain with a spring on it, because it's easier to defend and everything. We should get a topography map. That'd be kind of cool. All right, cool. Well, thank you for being here for Numbers. So I look forward to, in 2 weeks when we'll work our way through some actual content in Numbers, because compared to Leviticus and the end of Exodus, it's going to be exciting. There's actually stuff that takes place. And so, yeah. And I will try and figure out something with the Wi-Fi, why it's being weird.
It's not very strong.
No, yeah. There's an access point like over there, but it doesn't seem to